I've been asked on occasion, how do you come up with sermons? Well, sometimes it's someplace, maybe the Bible study that we talked about this week, or an event that's happened in my life or in someone else's life, or any number of things can trigger the topic for a sermon. But there are some Sundays during the year that are, by definition, lend themselves to a sermon. Christmas, Palm Sunday, the resurrection, Easter. Even the 4th of July and Memorial Day can lend themselves to a service. That we remember not only our veterans and those that died, but we remember the one who died for all of us. Labor Day is kind of tricky, though. It is a special Sunday. But how do you relate that to a biblical perspective? Well, I'm going to try to do that this morning. You see, I've always thought it odd that we have a national holiday to honor labor, and everybody takes the day off. I think if you want to honor labor, you go to work for free for that day. It's a very strange holiday. We call it Labor Day, and we spend our time doing as little as possible. Most working people have the day off. Nobody wishes anybody happy Labor Day. We don't decorate the house. We don't set off fireworks. We don't give Labor Day presents. Hallmark and flower shops haven't found a way to make money on it yet. I've never got my Labor Day card. But it's not a good holiday for church. It's the last day of summer. We're all going back to our jobs on Tuesday. I say we in an inclusive sense. Of course, I won't. I'll be sitting home eating bonbons and watching soap operas. Raymond Adams taught me how to do that. But it's not a good holiday for church. People travel. They try to squeeze in the last of the warm summer season. They go camping. They have social gatherings, family reunions. And the church's attendance goes down measurably on Labor Day weekend. You know, if you're a factory or office worker and you're still employed, you get the day off, hopefully a paid day off. But you know, if you're a cop, it's a tough day. It's a busy day. You got accidents, you got traffic, you got drugs and alcohol abuse. If you're a farmer or a rancher, like a dairyman, there ain't no day off in the dairy business. There ain't no day off in the farming business. You still got to feed the livestock. It's got field work to do, livestock to take care of. For preachers, it's an opportunity to talk about the biblical perspective of Labor Day. There is a biblical perspective, even though Labor Day is not mentioned in the Bible. There is a biblical perspective. Work is an important part of God's will for us. Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians, (4 and 11). Okay, it's on the wrong page. He instructs us to aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind our own business, and to work with your own hands, as he himself commanded the churches, that you may walk properly toward those that are outside, meaning non-believers, that you will lack nothing. He also wrote in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and 10, for even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, they will not eat. That's kind of harsh. But they had folks in the church that were relying on other people to take care of their needs and to feed them and take care of their housing. If they're not willing to work, then we're not encumbered with the responsibility to feed them. We hear there are some that walk among you not working at all, but they're just busybodies. Now those who are such, we command you through the Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. Not someone else's bread, their own. Even Paul was a trained tent maker. And he wrote, remember how when I was living among you, I didn't trouble you with my financial needs. I didn't expect you to take care of me or feed me or clothe me. I provided for myself with my own hands. Paul was a proponent of work. That's a biblical perspective on what we call labor, is our own work of our hands. I heard it said one time, somebody asked the Pope, they were taking a tour of the Vatican, and the Pope came out and he said, "How many people work here at the Vatican?" He says, "Oh, about half of them." I supervise an office, if that was real close to being true. There was a book written called Swim with the Sharks, written by Harvey Mackay. It was about a guy named Pillsbury. Have you ever used Pillsbury products in the kitchen? Nobody? Okay. Pillsbury flour? Yeah. About the importance of public leadership. Philip Pillsbury started the company, and when he was just getting going, he was a miller. He was a grinder of grain, a miller. And he was just starting the company, and he got his hand caught in one of his grinding machines, and he lost the tips of 3 fingers. But after his business got up and running, and he hired employees, and he had a whole factory full of millers coming in and grinding the grain every day and sacking it up and working, he was not opposed to leaving the front office, coming out on the workroom floor and instructing them how to do their job, even showing them how to do their job. He had a reputation for being a connoisseur of fine wine, but he was not afraid to go out and get his hands dirty. The moral of that story is the best leaders are first of all servants. Those who are greatest in God's kingdom, Jesus says this, will be the least. They're usually the ones that are missing 3 fingers. I remember back when I was working, there was a survey done by a business consultant named James Bleach. And when I was working, I heard about half of these on my job site. Excuses. It's not my fault. It's someone else's fault. Something came up. I didn't get to it. I didn't have time. We've never done it that way before. No one told me to do it. I'll get to it later. No one showed me how. But as I was looking through the biblical perspective on work, on labor, I kind of jotted down 3 points I'd like to make this morning. You know, God has always honored and provided work. Since He put Adam and Eve in the garden, He has honored work, physical work with our hands. Genesis 2:2, even God worked. On the 7th day, God ended His work and rested from all He had done. He worked 6 days and took a day off to rest. And that set the pattern for the Jewish culture of resting on the Sabbath. He created us in His image, and He gave us work to do. In Genesis 2:15, after Adam and Eve were in the garden, the Lord took man and put him in the garden and told him to tend the garden and to keep it. Well, this garden was a perfect place. It was a beautiful place. I don't know that it required a lot of work. There were no thistles and weeds in those days until the fall. But you know, when Jesus came to earth, God still honored work through Him. It's illustrated when He was born in Bethlehem. The shepherds were out watching their flocks by night. They were at work. You know, they worked 24/7. They stayed with the flock. Jesus learned His own trade as a carpenter in His father's carpenter shop. He worked in carpenter business until He was 30 and went into ministry. Jesus chose working men as His disciples. Peter, James, and John, and Andrew were all fishermen. Levi was a tax collector. We don't know about the other disciples, but we know the ones we do know. He took them away from their job and said, "Follow me, I'll make you fishers of men." He encouraged His disciples to work, to provide for themselves. In Luke 10, He says, "Remain in the same house." When you go around preaching, don't go from house to house begging, eating and drinking such things as they give you, for the laborer is worth his wages. He's talking about them being laborers, taking the gospel out into the world. He didn't want them begging. He wanted them to earn their own keep. So why do people think of work as bad? A lot of people do. Sin made work very unpleasant. Genesis 3:17. You know the story of Adam and Eve in the garden? As I was reading this, God cursed the serpent, says, you're going to crawl on your belly the rest of your days. And then he turned to Eve and he says, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and in your conception. The pain you shall bring forth children. Another passage says you will travail in childbirth. Now, that sounds like maybe where we get the word labor from. When women are giving birth, they go into labor. It ain't easy. It's work. And then he turned to Adam and says, because you heeded the voice of the wife, you've eaten from the tree which I commanded you not, saying you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. This is where the Garden of Eden fell apart. Cursed is the ground. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles shall it bring forth for you. And you shall eat the herbs of the field, and by the sweat of your face and your brow you will eat bread, until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and dust you shall remain. See, I believe Adam and Eve were placed in the garden. They were created. They were immortal in that sinless state. That God intended for them to live forever. But after the fall, we've heard the phrase, sin and death came into the world. That's when death entered the world. To dust you will return. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. That's when work came into the world. Adam enjoyed the Garden of Eden. Sin changed all that. We like to avoid work if we can. Some people do as little as possible. They want the most money for the least work. Some choose to be employees and employers and hire others. In America, we have a system of labor and management called unions, and they're adversarial because the unions want as much money as they can get for the least amount of work. Management is on the opposite side of the spectrum. I've worked in a union shop. It's not pleasant. And I believe unions have a place. But it's always an adversarial relationship. Anybody here have chores as a kid? Yeah. I've had some kids come work for me, and I can tell you right away, some of them know how to work, and some of them don't have a clue. I had one young person come out, and I showed them how to drive the gator. They were old enough. I just needed them to pick up sticks so I could mow. I got 2 sycamore trees in the train. And about 20 minutes later, I looked out the window, picked up a stick, put it in a gator, look at my cell phone. Picked up a stick, put it in a gator. They were at work in their mind. Had some other kids that picked up sticks like they're killing snakes. When did kids stop doing chores? Have you noticed many kids don't? They expect the parents to give them money. They want something for nothing. Many not only don't want to work, they don't know how. The second point I run across as I was thinking of this morning, the American system of work is not Christian. It's not biblical. You know, I look through the scriptures for a scriptural basis for retirement, and it ain't there. That is not a scriptural concept. We've created that in our secular world that you work so many years, and when you get a certain age, we can even set up a system, Social Security, where when you reach a certain age, you can retire from your labors. But it's not a biblical concept. The Amish don't receive Social Security. They work till they can't work anymore. I'm not sure I would enjoy that system. I kind of like being retired. Do what I want, hardly never. Paul wrote in Ephesians 6, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart. Be obedient to your masters as if you're doing it for Christ. How many of you that work, or how many of you did work, considered working for Jesus Christ? instead of your boss? Would you work the same way if Jesus was your boss? Or would you maybe be a little more attentive to your job? Would you maybe try to do a little extra, to do a little better, to do the best you could if Jesus Christ was your boss? You see, as Christians, we oftentimes fall in the habit of separating the secular from the sacred. What we do Monday through Friday is different than what we do on Sunday. The secular and the sacred. We're not consistent in our behavior. We're not consistent in our beliefs. We leave church and go out in the world, and Monday morning we get up, and for some reason we stop following the precepts of Christ. A Christian has no right to be righteous on Sunday and a heathen the rest of the week. There should be no separation for Christians. They should be Christians in all that they do. Do all that we do as unto the Lord, Paul says. Jesus is our boss. That's a commandment that's true today. Do all that we could. That's a commandment of Paul. It's a teaching. My dad had a bumper sticker on his car, and not long ago I got my new truck. I found the same bumper sticker, so I put it on there. It says, "My boss is a Jewish carpenter." He told me one time about getting chewed out at the gas station. The lady pulled in and gave him an earful. She thought he was being anti-Semitic. She didn't get it. Was your boss a Jewish carpenter? And the third point, the Christian does the best that he can for others. Paul says, do all that you do in sincerity of heart. Colossians 3:22. Fearing God, whatever you do it heartily as unto the Lord. Knowing that from the Lord you will receive a reward of the inheritance, that you serve the Lord Jesus Christ first. Christians should do more than expected because they work for the King of Kings. If they're right-minded, if they have a biblical perspective about whatever it is they do, that's the first and foremost, that they work as if Jesus is their boss. If they do, everything else will take place. Everything else will fall into place. Christian employers likewise should do more than they expect to. For they too, even though they have employees, they too work for the Lord. If everyone, especially Christians, would live by that one simple creed, to do everything you do as if you were doing it for Jesus, it would eliminate stress in the workplace. It would eliminate workplace disputes, workplace violence. Again, Colossians 3, Paul says it again in a different letter. Do all that you do it heartily as unto the Lord, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward. And I'll close with the true story. I like true stories that come out of here. In the first days of the war in the South Pacific, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed. It took us about 6 months to get into the war. And we sent the naval fleet into the South Pacific and into Europe. They divided the naval fleet and sent it both directions. One of the very first conflicts was a battleship by the name of the Astoria. And the Astoria came up against the flagship of the Japanese fleet, called the Chokai. And an ensuing naval battle happened, and the Astoria was victorious. Didn't take long for the Chokai to sink, the flagship of the Navy, the Japanese Navy. But the Astoria took a bad hit right in the #1 gun turret where the ammunition stood, and it blew a big hole in the boat, and it started to sink. Many of the sailors were thrown into the water, over 500 sailors on that battleship. One of them was a seaman. His name was Elgin Staples. And Seaman Staples had shrapnel all through his legs. And he was thrown in the water. He did have the foresight. When he assumed his combat position, he put on a life belt. Not a jacket, but he put on a life belt. And there was a trigger on it to inflate it. He ended up in the water, and that life belt was the only thing holding him up. He was in the water for 4 hours until another Navy ship come along, and they picked up as many survivors as they could. And they took them back to the Astoria because the captain was trying to ground the Astoria on a sandbar, on shallow water. And they could stay on the Astoria until help arrived. But he couldn't ground the ship. It ended up sinking before he could get it grounded on the sandbar. Again, all the sailors went back in the water. Seaman Staples was in the water for another several hours until he got picked up and taken to a hospital ship where they did first aid on him and they bandaged his wounds. He had lost a lot of blood. They sent him back stateside and he stayed in the hospital for some period of time, and then he was given medical leave to go home while he recuperated. He would still be expected to go back on duty once he was well, but he was sent home for enough time to recuperate. And he was talking to his mother. And he remembered everything about that life belt he had on. He had studied the color of it, the fabric of it, the buckle. He knew everything about it. And there was a tag that said, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, Akron, Ohio. That's where his mother worked. And that tag had a serial number on it. And he had looked at that belt so long that he had memorized that serial number. And he asked his mother what that serial number was for. What did that mean? What did that indicate? And the Firestone Company felt so strongly about their employees taking responsibility for their work as if they were doing it for Jesus, that each one of them had their own serial number. When they did their job, they had to put their serial number on that finished product so they knew who did it. Same thing in the parachute business. When a man, he used to have, you packed your own originally, but then they had a job called riggers, and they would pack the chutes. Well, they had to tie their name onto each chute they packed. So if they had a full malfunction, they would know who packed that chute. He asked her about the number. She said, do you remember it? And he told her. You know the end of the story. It was her number. She had manufactured the life belt that saved her son's life half a world away. You suppose she was glad that she had performed her job well that day? Are you missing the tips of your fingers this morning? Do you do everything you do as unto the Lord? I'll admit to you, I fall short of that. I don't do everything. I do a lot of what I do as unto Butch. But Paul said in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 10 and 31, this service is named the 1031 for that very reason. Whether you eat or drink or whatsoever you do all to the glory of God. Everything. Titus instructs us in his letter to be zealous for good works. Constantly be trying to do the best you can. Doing good works so that people that see you, and they will recognize that you're believers, they will glorify your Father who is in heaven. Because we are a peculiar people, and we will stand out by how we treat our job, by how we treat others, by whether we are sincere, whether we do our best job. In the workplace, someone that's really tearing it up and doing the best job they can oftentimes is told to slow down. I was when I started at the post office carrying mail. I was a substitute carrier on a walking route. And so when the guy had a day off, I'd carry his route. Well, it was an 8-hour route. I'd get back in 6. I wasn't trained to take my time and be slow. I was trained to do the best I could do. And I got conversations taking place more than once out in the parking lot about you're ruining my job. No, you ruined your job. I don't work any harder than you do. I just don't goof off as much as you do. I was not a very popular fellow with my fellow employees. But if we do the best we can in everything we do, we will be identified as a peculiar people. Why is Bill working so much harder than the rest of us? It could be that Bill's doing it as if he works for the Lord. And this Labor Day, maybe that's a thought we need to keep in our mind. Whether you eat or drink or whatsoever you do all for the glory of God. Those I've asked to serve, please come.